An ugly beggar woman was hired to care for a millionaire in a vegetative state, received with contempt by everyone in the mansion. While everyone had lost hope, she noticed something strange, a small movement, a look that no one else saw. In the following days, her persistence revealed the impossible, and everyone was shocked to discover the truth. Sarah Bennet stood at the wrought iron gates of Thornfield Manor, clutching her worn leather bag close to her chest. The autumn wind whipped through her plain brown hair, and she pulled her second-hand coat tighter around her shoulders. This magnificent estate loomed before her, its limestone walls and Gothic architecture, a stark contrast to the modest apartment she'd left behind in Boston. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the intercom button. A crackling voice answered. "Yes? I'm Sarah Bennet, the new caregiver for Mr. Alexander Winchester. If this story caught your interest, watch until the end and subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories." Continuing. After a moment's pause, the gates creaked open. Sarah walked up the winding driveway, fallen leaves crunching beneath her sensible shoes. Her heart pounded with each step. This position was more than just a job. It was her chance to prove herself in a world that had always judged her by her appearance rather than her abilities. The massive wooden doors opened before she could knock, revealing Mrs. Hawthorne, the stern-faced housekeeper. Her perfectly pressed uniform and immaculate grey hair spoke of decades of service to the Winchester family. "You're early," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her eyes sweeping over Sarah's modest appearance with barely concealed disdain. "I believe in punctuality," Sarah replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Follow me." Mrs. Hawthorne turned sharply, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Mrs. Winchester is waiting in the study." Sarah followed, trying not to gawk at the opulent surroundings. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and priceless artwork adorned walls covered in silk wallpaper. The air seemed heavy with wealth and privilege, and secrets. The study door opened to reveal Victoria Winchester, a woman whose beauty was as legendary as her husband's business acumen. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer dress made Sarah acutely aware of her own plain appearance. "So," Victoria said, not bothering to rise from behind the massive mahogany desk, "you're the new nurse." Her tone suggested she'd found something unpleasant on the bottom of her Louboutin heel. "Yes, ma'am. I specialized in long-term care and rehabilitation at Massachusetts General Hospital." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Spare me the credentials. You're here to keep my husband alive and comfortable. Nothing more." She picked up a thick folder. "These are his medical records and care instructions. Dr. Matthews will brief you on the specifics." Sarah accepted the folder, noting how Victoria avoided mentioning her husband by name. "May I see Mr. Winchester now?" Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Was it anger? Fear? "Of course, Mrs. Hawthorne will show you to his suite, but remember, Miss Bennet, my husband requires complete peace and quiet. No unnecessary disturbances." As Sarah followed Mrs. Hawthorne up the grand staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria Winchester's warning held more meaning than simple medical instructions. The housekeeper seemed to sense her unease. "A word of advice, Miss Bennet," Mrs. Hawthorne said quietly, pausing on the landing. "This house has rules, some written, some not. It would be wise to learn them quickly." They reached the west wing, where the air grew noticeably cooler. Mrs. Hawthorne stopped before a set of double doors. "Mr. Winchester's suite. Dr. Matthews will be here shortly." She hesitated, then added, "The last 3 nurses didn't last a month." Sarah squared her shoulders. "I'm not like the others." "No," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps you're not." The doors opened to a dimly lit suite that smelled of antiseptic and expensive cologne. Medical equipment hummed quietly, monitoring the still figure in the massive 4-poster bed. Sarah approached slowly, her trained eye taking in the various machines and their readings. Alexander Winchester lay motionless. His once powerful frame now seemed smaller beneath the silk sheets. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his strong features were relaxed in repose. At 45, he should have been in his prime, not trapped in this gilded prison of silence. Sarah moved closer, studying his face. Despite his condition, there was something compelling about him. a sense of dignity that even his current state couldn't diminish. As she checked his vital signs, his eyelids flickered slightly. "Mr. Winchester," she said softly. "I'm Sarah. Bennett, your new caregiver." For a moment she could have sworn his breathing changed rhythm, but before she could be sure, the door opened and Dr. Matthews entered, followed by Victoria Winchester. "Miss Bennett," the doctor said briskly, "let's discuss Mr. Winchester's care plan." As Sarah turned to face them, she missed the slight movement of Alexander Winchester's hand against the sheets, a movement that would have told her everything she needed to know about his true condition. But while she might have missed that subtle sign, she didn't miss the way Victoria Winchester stared at her husband with a mixture of impatience and barely concealed hostility. In that moment, Sarah realized that caring for Alexander Winchester would involve much more than medical expertise. She was stepping into a web of family dynamics and unspoken tensions that she didn't yet understand. But she was determined to unravel these mysteries, one careful observation at a time. Sarah's first week at Thornfield Manor revealed a household governed by strict routines and unspoken tensions. Every morning began the same way. She arrived at Alexander Winchester's suite precisely at 7, relieving the night nurse, a quiet woman named Margaret, who barely spoke 2 words before hurrying away. The morning routine was meticulous, checking vital signs, administering medications, physical therapy exercises, and personal care. Sarah noticed that despite being in what others called a vegetative state, Mr. Winchester's muscle tone hadn't deteriorated as much as she would have expected. It was as if someone had been exercising his limbs even before she arrived. "Good morning, Mr. Winchester," she said warmly, beginning their daily routine. "The gardens are beautiful today. The roses are still blooming, even though it's getting colder." As she worked, she maintained a steady stream of conversation, describing everything she was doing. Sometimes she could swear his breathing changed. When she spoke, becoming more regular, more focused. On this particular morning, as she was changing his position, she noticed something odd, a small notebook tucked between the mattress and the bed frame. Before she could investigate, Victoria Winchester swept into the room, perfectly dressed despite the early hour. "Miss Bennett," Victoria said sharply, "I hope you're not disturbing my husband with excessive chatter. He needs absolute quiet to rest." "Actually, Mrs. Winchester, research shows that regular verbal interaction can help stimulate brain activity in patients with consciousness disorders." Victoria's perfectly painted lips tightened. "Dr. Matthews has already established the appropriate care protocol. Please stick to it." As if summoned, Dr. Matthews appeared in the doorway. He was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, but something about his carefully neutral expression made Sarah uneasy. "Mrs. Winchester is correct," he said smoothly. "Mr. Winchester's condition is unique. Too much stimulation could be detrimental." Sarah nodded politely, but her mind was racing. In her experience, doctors usually encouraged family interaction with patients in Mr. Winchester's condition. Why was this case different? Later that afternoon, while organizing medical supplies in the adjacent room, Sarah overheard a heated conversation between Victoria and Dr. Matthews. "She asks too many questions," Victoria was saying, her voice tense. "And I've seen her watching him like she suspects something. Mrs. Winchester, please remain calm. Everything is under control. The medication schedule ensures—" "It better be. We can't afford any complications, not when we're so close." Their voices dropped too low to hear, and Sarah strained to catch more, but they moved away from the door. What medication schedule were they discussing? She'd reviewed Mr. Winchester's chart thoroughly, and something didn't add up. That evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave, Mrs. Hawthorne appeared at her elbow, making her jump. "Miss Bennett, a moment, please." The housekeeper led her into a small sitting room and closed the door. "You seem different from the other nurses." Sarah met her gaze steadily. "How so?" "You pay attention. You observe." Mrs. Hawthorne glanced at the door. "Perhaps you've noticed that things in this house aren't quite what they seem." "What do you mean?" The housekeeper's fingers worried at her apron. I've served the Winchester family for 30 years. I was here when Alexander was a boy, when he built his company from nothing, when he met Victoria." She paused. "The accident changed everything. But sometimes I wonder." A floorboard creaked outside the door, and Mrs. Hawthorne stiffened. "I've said too much. Just watch carefully, Miss Bennet, especially around medication time." The next morning, Sarah arrived earlier than usual. As she approached Mr. Winchester's suite, she heard unusual sounds, soft whimpers, like someone in distress. She hurried inside to find him agitated, his breathing irregular. "Mr. Winchester?" She touched his hand gently. To her shock, his fingers twitched against hers. Not the random movement of muscle spasms, but a deliberate motion. Sarah's heart raced. She quickly checked his vital signs, noting everything in her private notebook rather than the official chart. As she worked, she could have sworn she saw his eyes flutter, trying to open. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm here. You're safe." His breathing steadied at her words, and the tension in his body eased. Sarah stood there, her mind whirling with possibilities. The medication schedule, Victoria's strange behavior, Dr. Matthews's insistence on limiting stimulation, it all pointed to something deeply wrong. As she adjusted his blankets, her hand brushed against something hard under his pillow. Glancing at the door to ensure she was alone, Sarah carefully reached beneath the pillow and found a small voice recorder, its presence raising 1,000 new questions. Before she could examine it, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Sarah quickly replaced the recorder and stepped back, just as Victoria entered with her morning coffee. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw something dangerous flash in the other woman's gaze, a mixture of suspicion and fear that confirmed her growing certainty. Alexander Winchester wasn't as unconscious as everyone claimed, and someone wanted very much to keep him that way. The voice recorder weighed heavily on Sarah's mind. After 3 days of careful observation, she finally found an opportunity to investigate it while Victoria attended a charity luncheon. With trembling fingers, she retrieved the device from its hiding place and pressed play. The first several recordings were mundane, nurses reading vital signs, Dr. Matthews discussing medication adjustments. But then she heard something that made her blood run cold, Victoria's voice speaking in hushed tones with Dr. Matthews. "The new dosage should keep him subdued," the doctor was saying, "but we need to be careful not to leave any traces in his blood work." "I don't care what it takes," Victoria hissed. "Just make sure he stays exactly as he is until everything's finalized." Sarah's hands shook as she continued listening. Between snippets of daily hospital sounds and routine care, there were fragments of conversations that painted a disturbing picture. She began taking notes, documenting times, dates, and participants in these clandestine discussions. A soft sound from the bed made her jump. Alexander Winchester's head had turned slightly toward her, the first voluntary movement she'd seen during daylight hours. His eyes remained closed, but his breathing had changed, becoming more alert. "Mr. Winchester?" she whispered, moving closer. "Can you hear me?" His fingers twitched against the sheets. Sarah's heart raced as she took his hand, remembering her training about establishing communication with minimally conscious patients. "Squeeze my hand once for yes, twice for no." The seconds ticked by. Just as she began to doubt herself, she felt it, a weak but deliberate squeeze. "Oh my God," she breathed. "You're aware of everything, aren't you?" Another squeeze. Sarah fought to keep her voice steady. "Are they keeping you like this on purpose?" Squeeze. "The medications, they're suppressing your consciousness?" Squeeze. Before she could ask more questions, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Sarah quickly hid the recorder and pretended to be adjusting Mr. Winchester's pillows as Mrs. Hawthorne entered with fresh linens. The housekeeper's sharp eyes took in the scene. "Is everything all right, Miss Bennet? You look flushed." "Just warm in here," Sarah replied, trying to calm her racing heart. "Mrs. Hawthorne, how long have you known about Mr. Winchester's true condition?" The older woman stilled. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. You've been trying to warn me since I arrived." Mrs. Hawthorne carefully closed the door. "These walls have ears, Miss Bennet. But yes, I've had my suspicions. I've served this family too long not to notice when things don't add up." "Tell me about the accident," Sarah pressed. "What really happened that night?" The housekeeper's face grew troubled. It was after a board meeting. Mr. Winchester had been acting strangely for weeks, like something was weighing on him. He kept making changes to his will, meeting with lawyers. Then came the night of the accident. A noise in the hallway made them both freeze. Mrs. Hawthorne quickly busied herself with the linens while Sarah checked Mr. Winchester's vital signs. Victoria swept in moments later, her designer dress immaculate despite the rainy weather. "The charity luncheon ended early," she announced, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Any changes to report?" "No, Mrs. Winchester. Everything's stable." Victoria moved to her husband's bedside, her manicured hand brushing his forehead in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. "Poor darling. Always so still. So quiet. It's better this way, isn't it?" The words sent chills down Sarah's spine. She watched as Victoria opened her expensive handbag and removed a small vial. "Time for his special supplements," Victoria said smoothly. "Dr. Matthews insists on them." "I can administer those," Sarah offered, trying to keep her voice neutral. "No need. I prefer to do this myself." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You may take your break now, Miss Bennett." Sarah hesitated, torn between her duty to her patient and the need to maintain her cover. Mr. Winchester's heart rate had increased slightly. He was agitated. "Actually, Mrs. Winchester, I need to document his latest vital signs first." Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together. "Surely that can wait a few minutes." "Hospital protocols," Sarah said firmly. "We need consistent documentation for insurance purposes." As she methodically recorded each measurement, taking longer than necessary, Sarah noticed Victoria's growing impatience. The vial remained unopened in her perfectly manicured hands. Finally, Sarah could delay no longer. She gathered her notes and moved toward the door, her mind racing for a way to prevent whatever was about to happen. As she reached the threshold, she intentionally stumbled, knocking over a tray of medical supplies. "Oh, I'm so sorry." She scrambled to clean up the mess, watching from the corner of her eye as Victoria hastily tucked the vial back into her purse. "Really, Miss Bennett," Victoria snapped, "do try to be more careful. Perhaps you need a longer break to compose yourself." "Yes, ma'am. I apologize." Sarah left the room but didn't go far. She waited around the corner, listening intently until Victoria emerged 10 minutes later, her face tight with frustration. The vial, Sarah noted with relief, was still visible in her open purse. When Sarah returned to the room, Mr. Winchester's vital signs were normal. Whatever Victoria had planned to administer would have to wait for another day. As she checked his pulse, she felt his fingers press against hers, not a squeeze this time, but a pattern. 3 short presses, 3 long, 3 short. So yes. Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. Not only was Alexander Winchester conscious, but he was also completely aware and trying to communicate. The question was, how much time did they have before Victoria and Dr. Matthews realized their patient was breaking free of their chemical prison? Sarah spent her day off researching Alexander Winchester's past, combing through old newspaper articles and business magazines at the Boston Public Library. The story she uncovered was fascinating. 20 years ago, Alexander had started Winchester Technologies from his garage, developing innovative software that revolutionized the healthcare industry. His breakthrough came with a patient monitoring system that could predict medical emergencies before they happened. But it was an article from 6 months before his accident that caught her attention. Alexander had announced a new project, something he claimed would change the face of medical ethics forever. The article was frustratingly vague about details, but mentioned that several pharmaceutical companies had expressed concerns about its potential impact on their industry. Sarah printed the articles and added them to a folder she'd started keeping at her small apartment. As she reviewed her notes, a pattern began to emerge. Alexander's last public appearances had shown him agitated, distracted. One photo captured him in what appeared to be an intense argument with Victoria at a charity gala. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Thornfield Manor earlier than usual. The grounds were quiet, with only the gardener tending to the rose bushes. To her surprise, she found Mrs. Hawthorne waiting by Alexander's door. "Miss Bennet," the housekeeper whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. "There's something you need to see." She led Sarah to a locked room at the end of the wing. With trembling hands, she produced an old key. This was Mr. Winchester's private study. No one's supposed to enter, but... She pushed open the door, revealing a space frozen in time. The study was exactly as Alexander had left it the night of his accident. Papers were scattered across the massive desk, a half-empty coffee cup still sitting on a coaster. But what drew Sarah's attention was the wall of photographs behind the desk. "He loved horses," Mrs. Hawthorne said softly, watching Sarah examine the images. "Had a whole stable of them at his country estate. Used to say that riding cleared his mind when he was working on a difficult problem." Sarah moved closer to the photos. They showed a different Alexander Winchester than the business tycoon from magazine covers. Here he was laughing on horseback, his face relaxed and genuine. In several pictures, a beautiful blue Russian cat perched on his shoulder. "That was Azure, Mrs." Hawthorne explained. "His beloved cat disappeared. The night of the accident. Victoria claimed it ran away, but you don't believe that," Sarah finished. "Mr. Winchester would never have let that cat run away. He loved Azure like family." The housekeeper's voice cracked. "Victoria hated Feather Cat, said it she'd on her designer furniture, but Azure was Mr. Winchester's comfort during long nights working on his projects." Sarah noticed a leather-bound journal partially hidden under some papers. Before she could reach for it, voices echoed from the hallway. Mrs. Hawthorne quickly ushered her out, locking the door just as Dr. Matthews rounded the corner. "Miss Bennet, what are you doing in this wing?" "Just familiarizing myself with the layout," Sarah replied smoothly. "Mr. Winchester's physical therapy might benefit from short walks once his condition improves." The doctor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Mr. Winchester's condition is unlikely to change significantly." Later that morning, as Sarah went through the daily therapy routine with Alexander, she told him about her discoveries. His fingers twitched against hers as she described his private study, but when she mentioned Azure, his heart rate spiked dramatically. "The cat meant something special, didn't it?" she whispered. "Something more than companionship." One squeeze, yes. Sarah leaned closer, pretending to adjust his pillows. "Was Azure connected to your last project, the one that worried the pharmaceutical companies?" Another squeeze, stronger this time. A sudden knock made Sarah straighten up. Victoria entered, followed by an elegant woman Sarah hadn't seen before. "Miss Bennet, this is Elena Blackwood, our family attorney," Victoria announced. "She needs to discuss some legal matters with my husband, privately." Sarah gathered her supplies, but Alexander's heart rate monitor began beeping faster. She hesitated. "His readings are a bit elevated. I should stay to monitor." "That won't be necessary," Elena cut in smoothly. "This won't take long." Reluctantly, Sarah left the room, but not before she noticed Alexander's fingers forming that same pattern, SOS. Instead of leaving, she pretended to organize supplies in the adjacent room. Through the thin wall, she could hear the murmur of voices. "The transfer of power documentation is almost complete," Elena was saying. "Once you sign these papers, Victoria, you'll have full control of Winchester Technologies and all associated patents." "Excellent," Victoria replied. "And the new project files?" "Still no trace of them. If he hid them before the accident, they're well hidden." "They have to be somewhere." Victoria's voice turned sharp. "Those files are worth billions to the right buyers. Search his study again. Turn it upside down if you have to." Sarah's mind raced. The project files, the missing cat, the suspicious accident. It was all connected. But how? As if in answer, she remembered something from her research. Azure had been wearing a special collar in some of the later photographs, something that looked more technological than decorative. Later that evening, after Victoria and Elena left for dinner in the city, Sarah slipped back into Alexander's room. His eyes were open slightly, the first time she'd seen them clearly. They were a striking blue-gray, alert and intelligent. "Your cat," she whispered, holding his hand. Azure wasn't just a pet, was she? She was carrying something important, wasn't she? His grip tightened on her hand and his lips moved slightly. Sarah leaned closer, her ear nearly touching his mouth. His voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse, but the words were clear. "Find Azure. Save. Project." Sarah's heart leapt. He could speak, but before she could respond, she heard the distinct sound of Victoria's car returning up the driveway. She quickly adjusted Alexander's position and stepped back, her mind whirling with this new development. Somewhere out there, a blue Russian cat held the key to whatever Alexander had discovered, something so important that people were willing to destroy his life to keep it hidden. And now Sarah realized she might be the only person who could help him reclaim not just his life, but his legacy. Sarah knew she had to act quickly but carefully. With Alexander now able to whisper a few words, the stakes were higher than ever. She began by making subtle changes to his care routine, carefully documenting everything to appear professional while masking the true progress of his condition. During their morning session, she discovered that Alexander could maintain consciousness for longer periods when certain medications were administered at slightly different times, all within prescribed ranges, but enough to create windows of greater lucidity. She kept these observations in her private notebook while maintaining the official charts exactly as Dr. Matthews expected them. "Good morning, Mr. Winchester," she said cheerfully for the benefit of anyone listening. Then, in a whisper only he could hear, "I've been researching Azure. There's a pattern to when she disappeared." His fingers tapped against her hand, their private code for continuing. "The night you had your accident, 3 other things happened. Azure vanished, your private laptop disappeared, and," she paused, checking that they were truly alone, "your research partner, Dr. James Chen, suddenly left the country." Alexander's eyes opened slightly, the blue-gray irises intense with meaning. His lips moved, forming words she had to strain to hear. "Chen. Trusted. Azure." Sarah pretended to adjust his pillows while maintaining their whispered conversation. "Dr. Chen was involved with the project, the one that scared the pharmaceutical companies?" A slight nod. "Did Victoria know about Dr. Chen?" Before Alexander could respond, the door opened. Sarah smoothly transitioned to taking his pulse as Victoria entered, followed by Elena Blackwood. "Miss Bennet," Victoria's voice dripped with false sweetness, "I hope my husband isn't too taxed by all this attention." "Not at all, Mrs. Winchester. I'm just following the prescribed care routine." Eleanor stepped forward, her designer suit as impeccable as her polished manner. "Actually, Miss Bennet, we need to discuss some changes to that routine. The board of directors has expressed concern about the cost of such intensive care." Sarah felt Alexander's pulse quicken under her fingers. "I wasn't aware the board had any say in Mr. Winchester's medical care." "They do when company resources are involved," Elena replied smoothly. "We're considering transferring Mr. Winchester to a specialized facility." "That won't be necessary," Sarah said firmly. "Mr. Winchester is stable here, and moving him could be detrimental to his condition." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting you know better than the board of directors, Miss Bennet?" "I'm suggesting that as Mr. Winchester's primary caregiver, my medical opinion should be considered." Sarah met Victoria's gaze steadily. "And my opinion is that he should remain here." The tension in the room was palpable. Elena cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this further in private. Miss Bennet, if you could give us a moment." Sarah hesitated, but Alexander's fingers tapped against her hand. "Go." She nodded professionally and left the room, but instead of leaving, she slipped into the adjacent supply closet, where she could hear through the thin wall. "She's becoming a problem," Victoria was saying. "She asks too many questions, spends too much time with him. Do you think she suspects anything?" Elena's voice was concerned. "How could she? No one knows about the project except us and Chen, and he's safely out of the picture. Sarah's heart raced. She needed to find Dr. Chen. But how? As she pondered this, another voice joined the conversation. Dr. Matthews. Ladies, we have our situation. The latest blood work shows decreased levels of the supplemental medication. How is that possible? Victoria demanded. I've been administering it myself. Someone must be interfering with the schedule, and there's more. I've noticed slight improvements in his muscle response. If this continues, handle it, Victoria snapped. I don't care what it takes. The shareholders' meeting is in 2 weeks. By then, everything needs to be finalized. Sarah had heard enough. She quietly slipped out and made her way to the Manor's library, where she knew Mrs. Hawthorne would be doing her afternoon dusting. I need your help, she told the housekeeper quietly. Do you remember Dr. James Chen? Mrs. Hawthorne's hand stilled on her feather duster. Dr. Chen, he used to visit almost daily before, always carrying that strange equipment to Mr. Winchester's study. Did he ever mention where he lived? Or where he might go if he needed to hide? The housekeeper thought for a moment. He had a cabin up in the Berkshires, said it was the only place quiet enough to think. She hesitated. There's something else. The night of the accident, I saw him leaving with a pet carrier. I always assumed it was empty, but Sarah's pulse quickened. You think he took Azure? All I know is that the next morning both Dr. Chen and the cat were gone, and Mr. Winchester was... She trailed off as footsteps approached the library. Sarah quickly picked up a medical journal, pretending to read as Eleanor Blackwood entered the room. The attorney's eyes narrowed slightly at finding them together. Miss Bennett, the board has decided to bring in a consulting physician to evaluate Mr. Winchester's care. Dr. Phillips will arrive tomorrow. After Elena left, Sarah returned to Alexander's room. His eyes were clearer than she'd seen them yet. Chen in cabin, Azure, safe, he managed to whisper. Sarah squeezed his hand. I'll find them, I promise. But as she began gathering her things to leave for the day, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On her private notebook, left briefly unattended during the afternoon, was a single blue cat hair. Someone had been through her things. Someone knew she was getting close to the truth. And now she realized with growing unease, she wasn't just racing against time. She was racing against people who would do anything to keep Alexander Winchester silent forever. The arrival of Dr. Phillips changed everything at Thornfield Manor. He was a stern-faced man with cold eyes who insisted on reviewing every detail of Alexander's care. Sarah watched as he scrutinized her charts, his thin lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. Miss Bennett, he said during their first meeting, your documentation seems irregular. The medication schedules show unusual patterns. I've been adjusting the timing within prescribed parameters to optimize Mr. Winchester's comfort, Sarah replied carefully. Comfort? Dr. Phillips raised an eyebrow. A man in his condition hardly notices such things. But Sarah knew different. That morning, Alexander had managed to move his fingers enough to type a message on her phone while she pretended to check his blood pressure. Chen, cabin 42 Pine Ridge. Now as she faced Dr. Phillips's interrogation, she maintained her professional demeanor while her mind raced with plans. She needed to find that cabin, but she couldn't leave Alexander alone with these people. I'm implementing a new care protocol, Doctor, Phillips announced. All medications will be administered by myself or Dr. Matthews exclusively. Your role will be limited to basic care and monitoring. Sarah felt her heart sink, but she nodded compliantly. Of course, Doctor. Whatever you think is best. Later that afternoon, she found Mrs. Hawthorne in the kitchen, preparing Alexander's special dietary supplements. The housekeeper glanced around before whispering, They're watching you, Miss Bennett. That new doctor has eyes everywhere. I need your help, Sarah replied quietly. Do you know Pine Ridge in the Berkshires? Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes widened. That's where Dr. Chen's cabin is, but it's at least 3 hours from here. I need to go there, but I can't leave Mr. Winchester alone. Sarah hesitated. Is there anyone else in the household we can trust? The housekeeper thought for a moment. Thomas, the gardener. He's worked here longer than I have. He was devoted to Mr. Winchester's father, and he's never trusted Victoria. A plan began forming in Sarah's mind. She knew she had to move quickly. The shareholders' meeting was approaching, and Victoria seemed increasingly agitated. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed Elena Blackwood entering Victoria's study with a thick folder of documents. She pretended to gather her belongings while listening to their conversation through the partially open door. "Everything's prepared," Eleanor was saying. "Once you have controlling interest in the company, we can begin dismantling his research division." "And the project files?" Victoria's voice was tense. "If they're at Chen's cabin, our people will find them. But we need to move quickly. The pharmaceutical companies are getting impatient." Sarah's hand tightened on her bag. She had to get to that cabin before they did. As she walked to her car, she texted Mrs. Hawthorne, "Tomorrow. Need your help." The next morning arrived with a thick fog that shrouded Thornfield Manor in an eerie silence. Sarah implemented her plan carefully. First, she asked Thomas the gardener to plant some new roses near Alexander's window, a task that would let him keep watch over the room. Then, during her morning care routine, she managed to whisper to Alexander, "I'm going to find Azure. Trust Thomas and Mrs. Hawthorne. Don't take anything from Dr. Phillips." His eyes met hers with intense understanding, and his fingers spelled out against her palm, "Be careful." At precisely 10 a.m., Mrs. Hawthorne created a diversion by accidentally flooding the manor's main kitchen. As the staff rushed to deal with the crisis, Sarah slipped out to her car, armed with the cabin's address and a determination to uncover the truth. The drive to the Berkshires was tense. Every passing mile increased her anxiety about leaving Alexander, but she knew this might be their only chance. The autumn leaves were turning, painting the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, but Sarah barely noticed the beauty around her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Hawthorne. Dr. P giving new meds, T-watching, are resisting. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Alexander was fighting back in his own way, but how long could he hold out? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she turned onto Pine Ridge Road. The cabin, when she found it, was well hidden behind tall pines. It looked deserted, but Sarah noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt driveway. As she approached the door, a soft sound made her freeze. From inside came the distinct sound of a cat's meow. Sarah's heart leaped. Could it be? Before she could reach for the door handle, she heard another sound, a car engine in the distance growing closer. She quickly ducked behind some bushes as a black SUV pulled up. Two men in suits emerged, heading for the cabin. Through their open window, Sarah heard a phone conversation. "Yes, Mrs. Winchester, we're here now. We'll find those files." Sarah watched in silent frustration as the men broke into the cabin. She couldn't risk confronting them, but she also couldn't let them find whatever was hidden here. As she crouched in her hiding place, a flash of blue caught her eye. There, in a small pet door at the back of the cabin, sat a beautiful Russian blue cat, watching her with intelligent eyes. Around its neck was a collar that looked more like a piece of advanced technology than a pet accessory. Azure was alive, and she was waiting for Sarah. But with Victoria's men between them, and Alexander fighting his own battle back at the manor, Sarah faced an impossible choice. Time was running out, and she had to decide. Confront these men directly or find another way to reach Azure before the cat and the secrets she carried disappeared forever. Sarah's mind raced as she watched Victoria's men ransack the cabin. Azure remained perfectly still at the back door, those intelligent blue eyes fixed on Sarah with an almost human awareness. The cat's collar emitted a faint blue glow that pulsed rhythmically, definitely not a normal pet accessory. Her phone vibrated silently. Another text from Mrs. Hawthorne. Dr. P insisting on new procedure, a refusing medication, running out of delays. Hurry. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation, but she had something these men didn't. She had Azure's trust. Slowly, she circled around the cabin's perimeter, keeping low behind the bushes until she reached the back door. Azure didn't flee. Instead, the cat watched Sarah's approach with careful consideration, tail twitching slightly. When Sarah was within reaching distance, Azure stood and stretched lazily, as if this was a perfectly normal afternoon visit. "Hello, beautiful," Sarah whispered. "Alexander sent me." At the mention of his name, Azure's ears perked forward. The Ais. Kat took a deliberate step towards Sarah, the strange collar's light pulsing faster. Inside the cabin, she could hear the men growing frustrated. "There's nothing here," one growled. "No files, no computer, nothing but old furniture and dust." "Keep looking," the other snapped. "Mrs. Winchester said they have to be here somewhere." Sarah held out her hand to Azure, palm up, the way she'd seen Alexander do in the photographs. The cat sniffed her fingers delicately, then did something extraordinary. She reached up with one paw and touched the collar. The blue light changed to green. A soft click came from the collar, and a tiny compartment opened. Inside was a miniature USB drive no bigger than Sarah's thumbnail. Azure looked at Sarah expectantly, clearly waiting for her to take it. With trembling fingers, Sarah carefully removed the drive. As soon as she did, Azure's demeanor changed completely. The cat stood, tail high, and moved purposefully toward the dense woods behind the cabin, then stopped. Looked back at Sarah. Waited. "You want me to follow you?" Sarah whispered in realization. A crash from inside the cabin made her jump. "Check the basement again," one of the men shouted. Sarah didn't hesitate. She followed Azure into the woods, moving as quietly as possible. The cat seemed to know exactly where she was going, following a path only she could see through the underbrush. After about 10 minutes of careful navigation, they emerged at a small clearing. There, partially hidden by vines and autumn foliage, was another building, more of a workshop than a cabin. Azure trotted straight to the door and sat expectantly. Sarah tried the handle. Locked. But Azure wasn't done surprising her. The cat moved to a fallen log nearby and pawed at it until something metallic glinted in the leaves. A key. Inside, the workshop was a technology haven. Computers, servers, and equipment she didn't recognize lined the walls. Everything was covered in dust, except for one modern laptop sitting on a central desk. Azure jumped onto the desk and sat next to it, looking at Sarah meaningfully. "This is Dr. Chen's backup lab," Sarah breathed. "This is where he's been working all this time." Her phone buzzed again. Mrs. Hawthorne. "Victoria furious. Dr. P threatening to sedate A completely. Says it's for his own good." Sarah quickly powered on the laptop. To her surprise, it didn't ask for a password. Instead, a retinal scanner activated, and Azure positioned herself in front of it. A green light passed over the cat's eyes, and the screen came to life. What she saw made her gasp. Pages of research data, chemical formulas, and trial results filled the screen. But what caught her attention was the project's name, Neural Liberation Protocol. As she read through the files, the truth began to emerge. Alexander and Dr. Chen hadn't just been working on a new medical breakthrough. They'd discovered a way to prevent pharmaceutical companies from keeping patients dependent on unnecessary medications. Their protocol could identify and counteract artificial chemical dependencies created by certain prescription drugs. A multi-billion-dollar industry built on manipulating patient care would be transformed overnight. No wonder Victoria and the pharmaceutical companies wanted this buried. No wonder they kept Alexander heavily medicated. He wasn't just a wealthy man they wanted to control. He was a threat to an entire industry's profits. Sarah quickly copied the files to both the USB drive and her phone. As she worked, Azure stayed vigilant, ears twitching at every sound from the woods. A new text from Mrs. Hawthorne made her heart stop. "They're preparing an injection, strong sedative. Say it's necessary to transport him. Coming in 15 minutes. Sarah had what she needed, but she was hours away from the manor. She turned to Azure, who was watching her with those knowing eyes. "I have to get back to him," she said, "but I can't leave you here for them to find." Azure stood and stretched again, then calmly walked to a pet carrier hidden under a desk, one Sarah hadn't noticed before. The cat walked right in and sat down, clearly ready to travel. As Sarah gathered Azure and the vital data, she could hear vehicles approaching the main cabin in the distance. They were bringing more people to search the property. But it didn't matter now. She had what she needed, proof of Alexander's breakthrough and his faithful feline guardian. The question was, could she make it back to Thornfield Manor in time to prevent Victoria and Dr. Phillips from silencing Alexander permanently? As if sensing her thoughts, Azure reached a paw through the carrier's door and touched Sarah's hand. The gesture was so human, so reassuring, that Sarah felt her determination strengthen. She hadn't come this far to fail now. "Let's go save him," she whispered to Azure. "Together." The drive back to Thornfield Manor was a nightmare of urgency and impossible choices. Sarah pushed her old Honda to its limits, while Azure sat regally in the passenger seat, the carrier discarded in the back. The cat's collar continued to pulse with that mysterious blue light, somehow seeming to grow stronger as they got closer to the manor. Her phone kept buzzing with increasingly desperate messages from Mrs. Hawthorne. Dr. Phillips preparing sedative cocktail. Victoria called emergency board meeting for tomorrow. Thomas trying to delay them, says garden emergency needs immediate attention. They're not waiting much longer. Sarah glanced at her GPS, still 2 hours away. She needed help, someone closer who could intervene. Then she remembered something from her research. Alexander's old friend and business partner Robert Sullivan lived just outside Boston. His name had appeared in several articles about Winchester Technology's early days. At a red light, she quickly searched for his number and dialed, putting it on speaker. "Sullivan here," a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Sullivan, my name is Sarah Bennett. I'm Alexander Winchester's caregiver, and he's in danger." A pause. "Go on." Sarah quickly explained the situation, including the discovery of the Neural Liberation Protocol. Sullivan's sharp intake of breath told her she'd hit a nerve. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "Alex tried to tell me about the protocol before his accident, said it would change everything. Then Victoria suddenly had power of attorney, and no one could see him." "I need your help," Sarah said. "Can you get to Thornfield Manor? They're planning to sedate him completely, move him somewhere we can't find him." "I'm already getting my coat," Sullivan replied. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Just be careful, Miss Bennett. Victoria has powerful friends." As if to emphasize his warning, Sarah noticed a black SUV in her rearview mirror, similar to the ones at the cabin. It had been following her for the last 10 miles. Azure noticed too. The cat's ears flattened, and she made a sound that was almost a growl. Then, to Sarah's amazement, Azure reached out and touched the car's navigation screen with one paw. The system flickered, then showed a new route, one that wasn't on any map. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Sarah murmured, following the new directions. The route took them through back roads and hidden shortcuts, eventually losing their tail. Her phone buzzed again. Mrs. Hawthorne. "Dr. P preparing room for procedure. Elena here with papers, hurry." Then a new message from an unknown number. "This is Robert Sullivan. I'm 10 minutes from the manor, bringing reinforcements." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. They were still over an hour away. Everything would depend on Sullivan and the household staff buying them enough time. Azure suddenly became alert, her fur standing on end. The cat's collar light changed from blue to red, and a holographic display appeared, projected from the device. It showed a molecular structure rotating in the air between them. "Is this the key?" Sarah asked. "The formula they're so afraid of." Azure blinked slowly, a cat's way of saying yes. The hologram changed, showing a series of chemical reactions. Sarah wished she had more medical training to understand it all, but one thing was clear: this was revolutionary science. Her phone rang. Sullivan again. "I'm at the manor. Victoria's not happy to see me. She's claiming Alexander isn't well enough for visitors." "Don't let them move him," Sarah pleaded. "The protocol files, we have proof of everything." "Don't worry about that now. Just get back safely. And Miss Bennett, there's a helicopter landing pad behind the manor. Alex used it for business trips. Might be useful to know." Sarah's mind raced. A helicopter would take too long to arrange. But the threat of one might be useful. She pulled over and sent a quick email to every board member of Winchester Technologies, copying several medical ethics committees and journalists she'd researched. The subject line: "Emergency. Attempted. Cover-up of Winchester Technologies' Neural Liberation Protocol. She didn't include any files. That would come later, but the threat of exposure might give Victoria something new to worry about. It worked. Within minutes, Mrs. Hawthorne texted, "Victoria getting floods of calls. Dr. P told to wait." They were buying time, but Sarah knew it was temporary. Victoria would eventually realize she was bluffing about having sent the files to the press. Azure suddenly stood up on the seat, fur bristling. Through the windshield, Sarah saw what had alarmed her: a police roadblock ahead. 2 officers were checking each vehicle, and a familiar black SUV was parked nearby. "Victoria's friends," Sarah muttered. They'd been looking for alternate routes, knowing she'd try to return to the manor. But once again, Azure had a solution. The cat touched the navigation screen, and a new path appeared, a maintenance road that branched off just before the roadblock. It would be rough driving, but it would get them around the obstacle. As they bounced along the unpaved road, Sarah's phone lit up with a message that made her blood run cold. From Mrs. Hawthorne. "Elena found legal loophole. Says they don't need consent for emergency medical transportation. Team arriving in 1 hour." Sarah checked the GPS. They were still 50 minutes away, and that was with clear roads ahead. "We need help," she said to Azure. "Something more than Sullivan and the staff can provide." The cat's collar pulsed once, then projected a new hologram, a phone number with a name Sarah recognized from her research: Dr. James Chen. She dialed immediately, hoping against hope that he would answer. On the 3rd ring, a cautious voice responded, "Who is this?" "Dr. Chen. I'm with Azure, and we're running out of time to save Alexander Winchester." "Listen carefully," Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the phone. "Azure's collar contains more than just the research data. It's the key to reversing what they've done. To Alexander." Sarah glanced at the cat, who sat regally in the passenger seat, collar glowing steadily. "What do you mean?" "The Neural Liberation Protocol isn't just about preventing dependency. It can break existing chemical controls. That's why they were so desperate to stop us. Alexander tested the first prototype on himself the night of the accident." Truck horn blared as Sarah swerved around a slow-moving vehicle, but it didn't work. It worked too well. That's why they had to act quickly, create a cocktail of drugs to suppress his consciousness before the protocol could fully activate. But the formula in Azure's collar, it's the completed version. Sarah's mind raced. "So if we can administer it, he'll break free of their chemical control completely." "But Sarah, listen, Victoria has powerful allies. The pharmaceutical companies have private security forces disguised as medical transport teams. If they get him to their facility—" "They won't," Sarah said firmly. "We have help. Robert Sullivan is at the manor and—" "Sullivan's there?" Chen's voice sharpened. "Good. He can access the old security systems. Alexander had backup protocols even Victoria doesn't know about." Azure suddenly stood alert, fur bristling. Through the windshield, Sarah saw police lights ahead, another roadblock. "Doctor, Chen, I have to go, but how do we administer the protocol?" "Azure knows. The collar has everything you need. Just get there in time." The call ended as Sarah pulled over, pretending to check her map. The roadblock was thorough, no maintenance road escape this time. Azure touched the navigation screen again, but no alternate routes appeared. Then Sarah noticed something else, a railway line running parallel to the road, and in the distance the whistle of an approaching train. "We're not really going to—" She looked at Azure, who was already climbing into her carrier. "I guess we are." Sarah drove to the nearby station, arriving just as a Boston-bound commuter train was boarding. Using the last of her emergency cash, she bought a ticket. The roadblock wouldn't matter if they weren't on the road. Her phone buzzed with updates. From the manor, Mrs. Hawthorne. Transport team arriving sooner than expected. Sullivan stalling them with legal documents. Sullivan, accessed old security system. Ready when you are. Thomas the gardener. Strange men in medical uniforms checking grounds, looking for helicopter. Sarah calculated times in her head. The train would get them closer to Boston in 30 minutes. From there, they'd still need to reach the manor. Everything would have to be perfectly timed. She texted Sullivan, Need extraction from South Station in 30 mins. Then implement Protocol Lazarus. His response was immediate. You found the files, thank God. Car will be waiting. Azure settled into her carrier, but her collar continued to pulse, now projecting small holograms that only Sarah could see from her angle. They were instructions, detailed chemical formulas and administration procedures. You really are a remarkable cat, Sarah murmured. No wonder Alexander trusted you with everything. The train sped through the Massachusetts countryside as Sarah studied the holograms, memorizing every detail. She couldn't risk writing anything down, not with Victoria's people potentially watching. Another text from Mrs. Hawthorne made her heart race. Dr. Phillips preparing final sedation, says transport team requires it for safety, 1 hour maximum. Then, from Sullivan, stalled transport team with building inspection, fire marshal finding many violations that need immediate attention. Sarah smiled. They were all working together now, a network of people who believed in Alexander Winchester and his vision. The train began slowing for Boston when Azure suddenly became agitated. The cat's collar projected a new hologram, a warning. Chemical, structures labeled danger flashed in the air. Sarah quickly texted Mrs. Hawthorne, "What medications is Dr. Phillips preparing exactly?" The response chilled her. "Something new, says it's special protocol for transport." Sarah showed the message to Azure, whose collar immediately displayed the same chemical structure as the warning. They weren't just planning to sedate Alexander. They were going to put him into a near-comatose state that would make administering the neural liberation protocol impossible. "Time for Plan B," Sarah muttered, dialing Sullivan again. "Where are you?" he answered immediately. 10 minutes from South Station, but we need to move faster. How good is Manor security?" "Top of the line. Why?" "Because I'm going to trigger every alarm in the building. When I do, I need you to..." She outlined her plan quickly. It was risky, depending on split-second timing and perfect coordination, but with Victoria's transport team preparing their special protocol, they were out of options. As the train pulled into South Station, Sarah received one last text from Mrs. Hawthorne that confirmed their worst fears. Victoria ordered immediate preparation for transport, Dr. Phillips entering. "Alexander's room now." Sarah clutched Azure's carrier close as they hurried through the station. "I hope you're ready for this," she whispered to the cat, "because we're about to cause quite a scene at Thornfield Manor." Azure's collar pulsed with a steady, determined light. Whatever happened next, they were committed. The next hour would determine not just Alexander Winchester's fate, but the future of patient care itself. Sullivan's driver broke every speed limit between Boston and Thornfield Manor. Sarah sat in the back seat with Azure, watching the cat's collar project a countdown timer. They had exactly 28 minutes before Dr. Phillips would administer the final sedation. "All teams in position," Sullivan texted, "waiting for your signal." Sarah checked the instructions one last time. The plan was complex but necessary. They had 4 objectives: stop Dr. Phillips, neutralize Victoria's security team, secure Alexander, and administer the neural liberation protocol, all while avoiding Victoria's pharmaceutical industry allies. As they approached the manor gates, Sarah activated Phase 1. She used her phone to trigger the manor's emergency protocols, ones that even Victoria didn't know existed. Immediately, every alarm in the building began blaring. "Fire emergency protocols initiated," the manor's automated system announced. "All non-essential personnel must evacuate immediately." Through the gates, Sarah could see chaos erupting. Staff members poured out of the building, while security teams rushed in different directions, trying to determine the threat. "Now, Mrs. Hawthorne," Sarah texted. Inside, the faithful housekeeper implemented her part of the plan. She burst into Alexander's room, where Dr. Phillips was preparing his syringes. "Fire in the East Wing," she shouted. "Dr. Phillips, they need your medical expertise for evacuating critical care patients from the neighboring rooms." The doctor hesitated, looking at his prepared medications. "Doctor, please. There are elderly patients who need help." As planned, Thomas the gardener appeared at the door. "Sir, The fire marshal needs all medical personnel for evacuation procedures, hospital protocols. Dr. Phillips finally set down his syringes and hurried out. The moment he was gone, Mrs. Hawthorne locked the door and texted Sarah, "Medical suite secured." Phase 2 began immediately. Sullivan, using his old security clearance, activated the Manor's lockdown procedures, sealing off sections of the building. Victoria's security team found themselves trapped in various corridors, separated from each other. Sarah's car pulled up to the service entrance, where Thomas was waiting with a gardener's cart. "Quickly," he whispered, helping her load Azure's carrier onto it. They covered it with plants and gardening tools. Inside the manor, the alarms continued blaring. Victoria's voice could be heard shouting orders, trying to regain control of the situation, but the old security systems, now under Sullivan's control, weren't responding to her commands. "What do you mean you can't override it?" she screamed at her security chief. "This is my house." "Ma'am, these are protocols we've never seen before. The system isn't recognizing any of our codes." Sarah, dressed in gardening clothes provided by Thomas, pushed her cart through the chaos. Staff members rushed past her, following evacuation procedures. Victoria's security team was too busy trying to breach the locked sections to notice her. They reached the service elevator, the only one still operating under Sullivan's control. As they ascended to Alexander's floor, Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Mrs. Hawthorne. Dr. Phillips realized it was a diversion. He's trying to reach the medical suite through the air vents. "Ready?" Sarah asked Azure as they hurried down the corridor. The cat's collar pulsed with determined light. From it, a small compartment opened, revealing a miniature medical device, one that looked like a high-tech version of an EpiPen. They reached Alexander's room just as they heard crashes from inside the ventilation system. Mrs. Hawthorne unlocked the door and Sarah rushed to Alexander's side. "We're here," she whispered, taking his hand. "Azure's here too." His fingers squeezed hers weakly. Above them, the ventilation grate began to rattle. Azure jumped onto the bed and touched her collar to the medical monitoring system. Instantly, the equipment began displaying new readings, Alexander's true condition, not the suppressed version they'd been maintaining. "His neural patterns are growing stronger," Sarah observed. "The original protocol is still fighting in his system." The ventilation grate crashed open. Dr. Phillips began lowering himself into the room, medical bag in hand. "Step away from the patient," he ordered. But Azure was already in motion. The cat pressed against Alexander's hand, and her collar released the specialized injector into his palm. "No!" Dr. Phillips shouted, reaching for his own syringes. The door burst open. Victoria stood there, face contorted with rage, flanked by security guards. "Stop them! The protocol can't be administered." But she was too late. Alexander's fingers, showing more strength than they had in months, gripped the injector. Sarah helped guide his hand, and together they administered the completed neural liberation protocol. For a moment, everything froze. Victoria's security team, Dr. Phillips hanging from the ventilation system, Mrs. Hawthorne and Thomas blocking the doorway. All watched in stunned silence as the protocol entered Alexander's system. His vital signs began to spike. The monitors showed neural activity increasing exponentially. Dr. Phillips dropped into the room, reaching for his bag of suppressants, but Azure moved with shocking speed, knocking the bag across the floor. "Get them away from him!" Victoria screamed. "Sedate him immediately!" But Alexander Winchester's eyes were already opening, clear, alert, and blazing with awareness for the first time in months. His hand gripped Sarah's with surprising strength as the neural liberation protocol surged through his system, breaking down the chemical barriers that had kept him prisoner in his own body. And then he spoke, his voice hoarse but strong. "I want my wife out of my house." The security team, faced with their now conscious employer, hesitated. Victoria's face went pale. "Now!" Alexander commanded, his authority undiminished by months of silence. But as Victoria backed away from the door, her expression changed from fear to calculating determination. "This isn't over," she said softly. "You have no idea what you've done." She turned and fled down the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floors. Sarah started to follow, but Alexander held her back. "Let her go," he said. "We have all the evidence we need right here." He smiled at Azure, who had settled regally on his bed, collar glowing with triumphant blue light. "Sir?" Sullivan appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "I've contacted the board. They're convening an emergency session, and—" He smiled grimly. "The FBI is very interested in discussing medical fraud with certain pharmaceutical companies." Sarah felt relief flood through her, but she knew this was just the beginning. Victoria was still out there, the pharmaceutical companies wouldn't give up easily, and Alexander had months of recovery ahead of him. But as she watched him scratch, Azure behind the ears, his movements growing stronger by the minute, she knew they'd passed the point of no return. The truth was out, the protocol was working, and Alexander Winchester was finally free. What none of them noticed in their moment of triumph was Dr. Phillips quietly slipping away, clutching a single syringe filled with something that would ensure this victory was only temporary. The next 24 hours at Thornfield Manor were a whirlwind of activity. Medical specialists vetted by Sullivan arrived to monitor Alexander's recovery, while security teams swept the building for any remaining threats. Azure remained constantly at Alexander's side, her collar continuing to interface with the medical equipment, displaying his rapidly improving neural patterns. Sarah stayed too, watching in amazement as Alexander grew stronger by the hour. The neural liberation protocol was working even better than they'd hoped, breaking down months of chemical suppression and allowing his natural strength to return. "Tell me everything," he said to her that evening, his voice growing steadier with each conversation. "How did you figure it all out?" Sarah sat beside his bed, Azure purring contentedly between them. It was like solving a puzzle where someone had deliberately hidden the pieces. But there were clues everywhere, in the way Victoria behaved, in Dr. Phillips's suspicious treatments, in the strange gaps in your medical records. "And you found Chen's cabin," Alexander smiled. "I knew Azure would recognize someone we could trust." The cat's ears perked up at her name, and her collar projected a series of images, security footage from the night of Alexander's accident. They watched as Victoria argued with him in his study, her face contorted with rage as he refused to stop his research. "I had just finished the first trial on myself," Alexander explained. The results were promising, too promising. Victoria had already signed deals with pharmaceutical companies to bury the research, but she didn't know I'd created a working prototype. "That's why they had to act so quickly," Sarah realized. "The protocol was already in your system." "Yes, but it wasn't complete. They managed to suppress it with their cocktail of drugs, but they could never fully eliminate it. That's why they had to keep adjusting the medications. My body was constantly fighting back." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sullivan entered, his face grave. "We have a situation. Victoria's been spotted at Logan International Airport, boarding a private jet registered to Pharmacorp Industries." "Let her run," Alexander said firmly. "We have what we need here." He gestured to Azure's collar, which was now downloading its stored data to a secure server. But Sarah wasn't so sure. During her time at the manor, she'd learned that Victoria never gave up easily. "What about Dr. Phillips? Has anyone found him?" Sullivan shook his head. "Disappeared, but we've frozen his accounts and alerted authorities." As if sensing their concern, Azure suddenly became alert, her fur standing on end. The cat jumped down and paced to the window, staring intently at something in the garden below. Sarah moved to look, but Alexander grabbed her hand. "Wait," he said, his face serious. "There's something you need to know first. The Neural Liberation Protocol isn't just about breaking chemical dependencies. It's about exposing a bigger truth." "What do you mean?" "The pharmaceutical companies weren't just creating unnecessary medications. They were designing drugs specifically to create dependencies. Medications that could have been formulated without addictive properties were deliberately engineered to keep patients coming back. My protocol can prove it." Sarah's mind raced with the implications. "That's why they were willing to go to such extremes to stop you. This could bring down entire companies." "Exactly, and they won't give up just because I'm awake." He squeezed her hand. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. In my study, there's a hidden safe behind the photograph of Azure. Inside is a Backup drive containing everything, all the evidence we gathered before my accident. Before she could respond, Azure let out a low growl. Through the window, they saw shadows moving in the garden, figures trying to stay hidden among the topiaries. Sullivan immediately activated additional security measures, but Alexander remained calm. "They're too late," he said. "The protocol is already spreading through secure medical networks worldwide. Chen made sure of that the moment Azure's collar connected to our systems." Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Mrs. Hawthorne. "Dr. Phillips seen entering the East Wing. He's carrying medical equipment." Almost simultaneously, the manor's power flickered, then went out completely. The backup generators hummed to life, but several security systems remained dark. "They're making their final move," Sullivan said grimly, reaching for his phone to call in reinforcements. But Alexander was smiling. "No," he said, sitting up straighter in bed. "They're revealing themselves, and this time we're ready." Azure's collar suddenly projected a new hologram, a complex security grid of the manor, showing multiple red dots converging on their location. The cat's technological capabilities were far beyond what Sarah had imagined. "Victoria didn't just want to stop the protocol," Alexander explained, his voice growing stronger with determination. "She wanted to control it, modify it to create an even more powerful tool for pharmaceutical manipulation. What she never understood was that I designed it to be incorruptible." Sarah watched as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, testing his strength. "What are you doing? You're not strong enough yet." "I've been lying down for far too long," he replied, Azure moving to support him as he stood. "It's time to face them on our terms." The sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere in the manor. Security alarms blared to life and hurried. Footsteps approached their wing. Sarah looked at Alexander, standing tall despite his months of confinement, at Azure with her incredible technological collar, at Sullivan manning the security systems, and at her own hands still holding the evidence of all they'd discovered. They were in for one more fight, but this time they would face it together, standing up against those who would sacrifice human lives for profit. The real awakening wasn't just Alexander's recovery. It was the dawn of a new era in medical ethics. The next few minutes in Thornfield Manor unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. As Victoria's team breached the East Wing, Azure's sophisticated security grid guided the manor's defenders. Sullivan's security force intercepted the intruders with precision, while Sarah and Alexander made their way to his study through secret passages he had installed years ago. "I never thought I'd need these," Alexander said as they hurried through the narrow corridor, Azure leading the way with her collar providing light. "But my father was always passionate about having backup plans." They reached the study just as they heard Dr. Phillips's voice in the hallway outside. "Find Winchester. The protocol must be contained." Sarah helped Alexander to his desk, while Azure took up position by the door. The cat's collar was now projecting a countdown, the time remaining until the protocol's worldwide release would be complete and irreversible. 3 minutes, Alexander said, typing rapidly on his computer. "That's all we need." The door burst open. Dr. Phillips stood there wild-eyed, holding a syringe. "Step away from the computer, Alexander. You don't understand what you're doing. The medical industry can't handle this kind of disruption." "The medical industry," Alexander's voice was cold, "or the web of profit you've built by keeping patients dependent on unnecessary medications." Victoria appeared behind Dr. Phillips, her designer clothes, disheveled from her rushed return to the manor. "You're going to destroy everything we've built. Thousands of jobs, billions in research." "Research designed to create addiction rather than cure illness," Sarah interjected. "We've seen the evidence in Azure's files." "Speaking of evidence," Sullivan's voice came from behind them. He and his security team had surrounded the doorway. "The FBI is very interested in the contents of Dr. Phillips's private files, especially his correspondence with certain pharmaceutical executives about maintaining patient compliance through chemical adjustment." Dr. Phillips lunged forward with the syringe, but Azure moved faster. The cat leaped, knocking the syringe away. It shattered on the floor as security officers rushed in to restrain both him and Victoria. "It's done," Alexander announced, looking at his screen. The Neural Liberation Protocol is now in the hands of medical researchers worldwide. Every major hospital, research institution, and ethical review board has access. Victoria's face contorted with rage. "You fool! Do you know how many people will lose their dependency on manipulated medications?" Sarah finished. "That's exactly the point." The manor's lights fully returned as backup systems came online. Through the study windows, they could see FBI vehicles arriving, their lights painting the garden in flashes of blue and red. "Mrs. Winchester," a federal agent appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Phillips, we have some questions about certain financial transactions with PharmaCorp Industries." As they were led away, Victoria turned back one last time. "I did love you once, Alexander. Before all this idealistic nonsense about helping people." "No," Alexander said quietly. "You loved what I could give you. There's a difference." Hours later, after the FBI had collected their evidence and the manor had quieted, Sarah found Alexander in the garden. He was sitting on a bench, azure in his lap, watching the sunrise. His strength was returning remarkably fast, the protocol working to restore his natural vitality. "The board just voted," Sullivan approached them, grinning. "You're officially back in control of Winchester Technologies, and pharmaceutical company stocks are dropping as the first analysis of the protocol hits the medical community." "And the other matter?" Alexander asked. "Done. All the paperwork has been filed. Victoria won't be able to touch any of it." Sarah started to step away, feeling like an outsider in this business discussion, but Alexander caught her hand. "Stay," he said softly. "After all, you're now officially the head of Winchester Technologies' new medical ethics division." What?" "If you want the job," he smiled. "We need someone with both medical knowledge and unshakable integrity to oversee the protocol's implementation. Someone who sees people, not profits." Sarah looked at Azure, who blinked slowly at her in approval. "But I'm just a nurse." "You're the woman who saved my life, exposed a massive pharmaceutical conspiracy, and helped launch a medical revolution, all while everyone underestimated you." He stood, still holding her hand. "So what do you say?" 6 months later, the first official trials of the Neural Liberation Protocol began. Sarah oversaw them personally, working with an international team of ethical medical researchers. The results were beyond their hopes. Patients trapped in cycles of pharmaceutical dependency were finally finding freedom. Victoria and Dr. Phillips faced federal charges for medical fraud and corporate conspiracy. The pharmaceutical companies involved underwent massive restructuring under new regulatory guidelines inspired by the protocol's revelations. Thornfield Manor transformed too. Alexander converted the East Wing into a research center for ethical medical development. The gardens where Sarah had once pushed his wheelchair now hosted recovering patients participating in protocol trials. Azure remained their constant companion, her technological collar becoming the prototype for a new generation of medical monitoring devices. The cat seemed to take particular pleasure in supervising the manor's new therapy animal program. 1. Evening. As Sarah finished reviewing patient data in the study, she found Alexander standing by the window. He was fully recovered now, his strength and vigor restored. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, joining him. "Remembering the day you arrived," he smiled. "Everyone else saw what they expected to see. Just another nurse who wouldn't last a month. But you saw me, the real me trapped inside." "And you saw me," she replied, "not just the plain, unremarkable woman everyone else dismissed. I saw someone extraordinary." He turned to face her. "I still do." Azure jumped onto the windowsill between them, her collar glowing softly in the twilight. Outside, the garden was filled with blooming roses, the same ones that had witnessed Sarah's first days at the manor. "We did it," Sarah said softly. "We actually changed things." "We're just getting started," Alexander replied, taking her hand. "There's so much more we can do, so many more people we can help." As the sun set over Thornfield Manor, its light caught Azure's collar, creating a prism that painted the study walls with dancing colors. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from grand gestures or obvious heroes, but from those quiet souls who refuse to look away from injustice, who fight for what's right even when no one expects them to win. And in that moment, Sarah Bennett, once dismissed as plain and unremarkable, stood tall beside the man she'd saved and the cat who'd helped her do it, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Because she had learned what Alexander had known all along, true beauty, true strength, and true love are found not in appearances or power, but in the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost.